Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 14th episode of the webinar series called Wildlife Chronicles, organized by Center for Wildlife Studies. Our topic for the day is science behind snake bites. And as the panelists, we have Dr. Anita Malhotra and Gerry Martin present with us. I'm Abhishta Rao, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Before I begin with the speaker introductions, I request all of you to keep your audio and video muted for the entire duration of the webinar. There is time allocated at the end of the meeting for audience questions, and I request all of you to drop your questions in the chat box below. And to begin with the speaker introductions, we have with us Dr. Anita Malhotra, who is a reader in zoology, molecular ecology, and evolution at Bangor University in the United Kingdom. She specializes in understanding the taxonomy and evolutionary history of pit vipers in Asia. And she has also been studying the evolution of their venom. Her research focuses on the role of natural selection in population adaptation and divergence. She is currently mapping the distribution, genetic variation, and the venom variation present in venomous snakes across our country. She has also collaborated with Indian institutions to undertake rescue training and education and awareness programs in India. And Gerry Martin is a herpetologist, conservationist, and the founder of the Liana Trust, based in Hunsur in Karnataka. His organization focuses primarily on human-snake conflict through rural education and also works towards conservation and socio-economic issues in these rural landscapes. He is currently carrying out a radiotelemetry study of one of the big four venomous snakes of India, the Russell's viper. He has also been involved in extensive snake venom research with the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Notably, he has also worked in television series in association with BBC, the National Geographic Channel, and the Paramount Pictures. So today I will be running a series of questions and answers, and I would like to begin the question by asking the two of you. Snakes are generally a species which are generally animals which are feared by people. So how is it that you came to work with these species, with these snakes, and thereby their interactions with human beings? And Gerry, would you like to start?
So I've never been able to answer that question really. I think I've always enjoyed all kinds of animals. The snakes somehow seem to be more enigmatic and even charismatic to me. And that's irrelevant of how the rest of the world sees them. I think I've just enjoyed watching them. I love having them around. There's a lot of wild snakes here, and I think if given a chance, they can be very, very interesting and charismatic as well.
Right. Okay. And the other thing is, whenever if a person would say that he would want to get involved with snakes, there would be a stigma involved where the family members would say that you might get bitten by a snake, or it's a dangerous profession for you to follow. So how is it that you could overcome that issue as well?
Well, to be honest, my family was in the Middle East and I was here, so that made it easy. But I think there are a lot of stigmas, like you said, involved with snakes. But working with snakes is no more dangerous than driving a car, especially on a highway here in India, or a scaffolding, a construction worker on a bamboo scaffolding 7 stories up. In fact, that's probably more dangerous than working with snakes. So yeah, the stigmas are unfounded.
Right. Okay. And Anita, how is it? Would you describe your experience of starting to work with snakes? And
yeah, I think I had a fairly different introduction to it than Gerry. I mean, I was very interested in animals as a youngster, but I've never really come across snakes because I lived in a big city. I actually grew up in Kolkata in India, and we didn't really come across snakes. I never really absorbed any of that, the stigma or the fear attached to snakes, because it just wasn't an issue. And so when I did come across snakes through actually Deepak Mitra brought some of his snakes. He used to run the snake park in Calcutta, and he brought snakes to the school. And what really struck me, apart from the fact they were really beautiful, is that almost everyone else in the class was terrified of them. And it seemed totally unreasonable to me, because these were patently not venomous snakes. He wouldn't have brought them to the school. So I think that, as much as the intrinsic beauty of the snakes, attracted me to the study of snakes.
Right. Okay. Got it. That's an interesting way to get into it. And diving into the next question, and which is rather a serious one. So on an average, about 50,000 people die in India every year due to snake bites, and almost thrice as many suffer permanent physical damage. And so this number is quite massive and not something that can be neglected. So what are some of the projects that you have been working on, and how is it helping mitigate these numbers? Because I'm sure that there's no one silver bullet to answer this question of how to stop snake bites. So how is it that your project has been affecting it, and what are your studies? Dr. Anita, I'll start with it.
Okay, so as you said in the introduction, I already got started in this by just studying the taxonomy and the systematics of Asian venoms, pit vipers, which were already taxonomically all messed up, you know, in the early 90s. But as I worked on that sort of rather academic goal, inevitably you come across people who have had unfortunate encounters with snakes, and so it becomes very important eventually to do something about that. I mean, you can't really work on snakes without addressing that major issue. I mean, it's a huge issue from all sorts of perspectives, from the snake's perspective, just as much as the people, because of course all snakes suffer for the reputation of a few and get killed. So, but India, I mean, India's herpetologically so unexplored that in order to really address the issues of snakebite, you need to know the basic biology. You know, it's someone actually wrote a letter to the Lancet a couple of years ago saying that trying to tackle snakebite without looking at the basic biology of the snake was a bit like trying to solve malaria without bothering about mosquitoes, without learning anything about mosquitoes. So at the moment, that we just really don't know what the species are, what their distribution is, and some of these are highly dangerous species, the crates in particular. So moving a little away from pit vipers now, but you know, and India is such a vast country and has different biogeographic zones that you know there's no one size fits all solution. But we can't really start to tailor the solution more logically, taking this into account until we actually know what's there and you know what the situation is. So that's really why I got started trying to do something about that in India. So although we are working on, as you said, venom variation and other things, my main focus as a molecular geneticist is looking at genetic variation across India.
Right. Okay. As you said, it is very much important to know the basics of what these snakes are and what exactly is venom and how each one differs and how it affects the snake bite issue that's there. And
also just their basic behavior, you know, to actually work out, you know, some snakes are highly dangerous, highly venomous, but they never come into contact with people. So we don't really need to worry about them. So we also need to work out where, you know, where the areas of overlap are between people and
right, where the problem exactly lies,
yeah.
and then go about it.
Yeah.
And Gerry, would you like to speak about the project that you've been working on trying to address this issue?
Yeah, in fact, yeah, there's actually a fair amount of it has actually stemmed from things that Anita has initially said. And also, I remember a long time ago, Anita mentioning, we were talking about the use of mosquito nets and whether they actually worked. And I think we were in Arunachal at that point and sitting and discussing snakebite. And Anita said, yeah, but no one's ever tested whether a mosquito net actually works or not. And it sort of struck me then pretty hard that, we really know very little about snakes, and so much, and more so the dynamics between humans and snakes. And so much of what we decide to do, or even in our outreach, is based on anecdotal opinions. And I think it's really important for us to, considering that we're dealing with something that's so serious, not jump the gun to uh, to come up with solutions without actually having all the understanding that we have. So something as simple as what the snakes are doing when we all know what people are doing when they get bitten. We all know what kind of people get bitten. I mean, not all, but it's the data is sort of there, but there's very, very little information about what the snake was doing. Propensity to bite, for example, what the triggers are. So these are the kind of things that we're trying to take up now, and it's it's difficult, but I think there's a large enough team coming together to actually do these things, and there's people working in different parts of the country as well on similar aspects in different regions and on different aspects as well. So I don't think there's anything that we can do right now that would be unwarranted or too much to do. So we have to explore all these things to truly understand the nature of the beast before we figure out what we want to do about it.
Okay, got it. So essentially, understanding the nature of the snake, the behavior of it, and the venom associated with it is something that comes primary and is what is the need of the hour. Right. So speaking about this, one of the lesser known facts is that the same species of snake can have different venom compositions. And this is something that's come to be a serious problem that needs to be tackled. So, Anita, would you like to talk about what you have learned from mapping the distribution of venom and genetics of these snakes and the variation in them?
So the
And
first
how,
thing to say
right.
really is that we're still at a very early stage of this mapping. I mean, some papers have recently come out from the group that Gerry's working with, and we got a couple of papers in the pipeline. But even after years of work, there's still relatively few locations that have been included. So when we talk about mapping, we're not really there yet. Ideally, mapping would involve a much larger sample size, a much better sampling. But there's so many obstacles to overcome before you can get to that stage. I mean, the amount of work that groups who are working on this have to put in just to get the basic permit to collect the samples. And none of this is really harming the snake. The snakes are released at the end of it, and many of them are actually being caught anyway because of they're in conflict situations and they're being rescued. So the additional task of just being there and getting your samples shouldn't be such a big barrier to overcome, but it is. It takes years to get permits to do this mapping. On top of that, of course, none of this is particularly cheap work to do especially the venom analysis. So we need funding to put in to employ people and to actually to be able to generate this data on a large scale. And that is difficult to obtain as well, even with the more recent highlighting of snakebite as an issue that's come about since it was put on the most neglected tropical diseases list by the World Health Organization only a couple of years ago. The funding actually, especially for these basic studies, has not been flowing, as you might expect, having been highlighted. So it's still a struggle to get that basic data out. And it shouldn't be. Everything that needs to be done has to start from that basic point. And that's where the funding needs to go. Let us get it done in a couple of years, and it could be done as a proper mapping. So to get back to your question, sorry, what we're finding is some of these species that we think of as one species distributed right across India are not, that there are distinct genetic breaks. And this includes many of the big four species. In fact, all of them except the cobra, which for some reason bucks the trend and looks pretty much identical right across India from Kanyakumari right up to Himachal Pradesh. Genetically, I'm speaking. Morphologically, there's a lot of variation. But Russell's viper, the saw-scale viper, and the common crate show genetic breaks between southern India and northern India. And this is particularly of concern because, well, for one thing, it might account for some of the venom variation that we've observed. But secondly, all the venom that's being supplied to the anti-venom manufacturers for the manufacture of the anti-venom comes from the Irula cooperative in Tamil Nadu. Just one small area of the country being sampled to make the anti-venom that's supposed to treat bites on these species right across India. It just doesn't really make much sense. And people have been, it's not as if this is news. People have been talking about this for a decade at least. And yet the situation has not changed. However, the more evidence we can supply and publish that reinforces this message, the better.
I think you brought up a very important point, which is that firstly, to do with the funding and also the permits, both of which is something which is very basic and very necessary, and from which we can only move ahead, where the foundation of it lies is where we have the blockers at the moment. And like you mentioned, we do get our venom from just one particular part of India, which is in the southern India. So my question to Gerry is, have you seen any instances where the venom that is being produced from the Irula society, is it not working in other parts of the country, or have you had any experiences as such where the polyvalent venom is not working?
Yeah, so the Irula cooperative only produces the venom, and that goes to the various anti-venom producers, and they produce venom. There's a lot of clinical, both clinical and preclinical evidence that shows that the anti-venom is working to different degrees and also not working in some locations. There are large parts of the country that don't have any of the big four. So aside from venom variation within the species, there's also a lot of places where the big four don't exist, and we still only have the same polyvalent antivenom for the big four in places like the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, in all of the northeast of India. So it's yeah, in much of the trans-Himalayan regions as well. So there's doctors who talk about various things, from the antivenom actually causing a large amount of allergic reactions, to the antivenom not working very well, and them having to give copious amounts of antivenom. The problem with a lot of these is, again, many of them there's very little standardized work that's happening in clinics around the country. So it's very difficult to take reports at face value. And again, even on this front, there's a lot more investigation that needs to be done. Like Anita pointed out about things like the permits, we still are thinking very politically on, for example, we need to get permissions at the state level to actually be able to sample venoms or to do any work with snakes. The problems with that is snakes don't think on these political grounds, and that's not how things work biologically. What we do need is something like a pan-India type of permission where we can sample anywhere. Which of course is this utopian dream that we will keep having, and it's not going to happen. But the level of sampling that's required is both very difficult administratively, and I mean it's going to be ridiculously expensive as well. So the solution really is for the government to support it in a much more tangible way than the few comments they make and a little bit that they have on media about it. There's not enough support for something like this. This number of people are being affected every year.
Okay, yes, got it. One point that you brought up here is that these studies are expensive and would require a lot of funding. So speaking of which, there are about 200,000 casualties as a reason of snake bites, and most of them, if not all of them, are from the poorer section of the society. So how is it that we can make this antivenom more cheaper or available for the mass? And also the snake, I've also heard about the snake diagnosis kit where you can make out what is the type of snake it was, right, just from the bite. So how is it that we can make this kit and also the antivenom and both of it cheaper for the mass, as it's mostly the poorer sections who are affected?
Gerry, do you want to take
Yeah.
that? I can respond to the snake detection kit, but for the availability of the antivenom, I think it'd probably be better if Gerry took that.
Yeah. So yeah, the antivenom. So technically, we're supposed to get antivenom for free in most of in any government hospital. It's meant to be given for free, and so the cost really is a cost to the government and not so much to the individual. But there need to be regional venom production centers and regional antivenom as well, in my opinion. But it's a lot of work, and it's. I mean, we don't even know what those regions need to be at the moment. We don't know which snakes are where and where venoms vary enough. We have few. We have details and we have samples from different parts of the country, but they're just really tiny samples of, you know, 1 or 2 places in each state. Um, and until we have a very clear idea, like Anita said about, you know, when we say something like mapping, it actually infers a really rigorous and very extensive sampling that has been done, but that's not the case at the moment. To make antivenom more affordable, it needs to be more effective as well. So until we can get to an antivenom that works for the snakes that are, you know, in an area, and then it's not going to be particularly effective as long as we keep thinking of this as a national level thing where we have one silver bullet that works around the country.
So when it comes to the snake detection kits, so the famous example of where they've been used very effectively is in Australia. But the reason for having them is that they have a number of different antivenoms available in Australia. So it's always better to use a monovalent antivenom if it's available than a polyvalent one, if you know what the species of the snake is. Okay, so in Australia, they have a number of different options available. And if they can identify the snake, then you know, then they can administer the most effective antivenom. That's not the case in India at the moment. There's just the one polyvalent antivenom. So at the moment, there's no real justification in producing a snakebite antivenom. A snake detection kit, because in the end, you've only got all you need to know is this patient envenomed or is he not? And if he's envenomed, you give the antivenom. Okay, so a lot of people have said, okay, so what we need to do is rather than have this polyvalent antivenom, is produce monovalent antivenoms. There are problems with that because, as we mentioned, you know, it's venom variation within a species would make it very difficult to do that. But and that also applies to the snakebite and venom, the snake detection kits. They essentially work by detecting particular substances in the venom that are characteristic of a particular species, but where it varies a lot, you'd have to be very careful that what you were selecting as the molecule that you're trying to detect was actually present in all the venom of all that species all over India, which I think is probably a bit of a struggle. So there have been some attempts, I think, at producing antivenom detection kits in India, but as far as I know, none of them have actually proved to be effective, you know, in the wider context. So there's a lot of argument about the use of snakebite, I keep saying this wrong, snake detections, identification kits. And in a very diverse country like India, where also the other thing about Australia is, of course, they have mostly elapids. So they can treat their bites very effectively with antivenom because it's mostly systemic effects. Whereas where in India, where there are a lot of vipers that are producing some of these very serious effects, they're not so easily treatable with antivenom because a lot of the the damage is caused by locally acting metalloproteinases and things like that, which cause a lot of very severe tissue damage, which causes a lot, at least of the long-term disability that results from snake bite. And a lot of these things are not really tackled by antivenoms. So we also, on top of looking at antivenom, which treats perhaps the systemic lethal effects, respiratory paralysis and so on, we need to develop alternative treatments that neutralize some of these enzymes that are causing very severe local tissue damage.
Okay. So the priority
completely out of my sphere, but
right.
I know that there are moves along these lines too.
Okay, so the priority would rather lie in coming up with the right antivenom rather than looking at a snake detection kit or anything as such. At least that's what the need of the hour is, or that's how it is in India.
That's my personal view, and I know it's held by a few other people, experts in the area of yeah.
Okay.
Gerry,
Gerry seems
you
to also
too?
agree with it.
Oh, but I completely agree with that thing. There's the last thing we need is to complicate things more when it comes to the response to snakebite in India. And unfortunately, so I mean, if a diagnostic kit were to work well, it might be a really good idea. The margin for error is very high at the moment. So I think people should keep maybe looking into it, but it's not something that we should think about bringing in yet. You never know what they might come up with. But there's also the big danger of a lot of false positives that come in, because in my understanding, diagnostic kits are usually they usually have markers for certain proteins or enzymes, and there are a lot of other species of snakes that might have the same thing. And giving people antivenom needlessly is also putting them at risk. So it's best to, I mean, the diagnostic kit, I think, should be studied somewhere, but not brought out at the moment.
So the other thing, of course, is there's always this emphasis in India about the big four. And I think it's becoming more and more obvious. I mean, when you've only got 4 species to cover in a snakebite envenomation or a snake detection kit, that may be feasible, but that's actually not the reality on the ground. There are a whole load of other species that you would need to include, and the more species you include, the more difficult it actually becomes, because the number of possible venom proteins that you might need to detect becomes unrealistic. But there are other approaches. Those are based on immunological approaches. There are things like aptamers, which are a more modern approach, which has they sort of mimics. They're not actual proteins, but they sort of mimic some of the toxins in these snake venoms. And I know there are groups working on this as well. And it's much cheaper to produce than the snake kits, which depend on immunological reactions. So there are lots of things in progress, and really we just need the funding and the will, the political will to get it done. I mean, look what's been done about COVID in such a short period of time. If there was that amount of will and and effort put into solving snakebite, to do so much.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that point. COVID is something that the whole world is now responding to, and there are a lot of pharmaceutical companies that are trying to come up with the vaccination for it. Even if some of that attention is diverted towards snake bites, I think that would be a great thing. But as we know, like, it's mostly the poorer sections of the society, or usually the voiceless ones, who are affected by it, and I think that is also impacting.
That's why it's carried on and on and on being such a problem, because the political will hasn't been there. But hopefully now, with the World Health Organization kicking into action with their roadmap, and it is lots of countries, including India, have signed up to it. So things hopefully will start to change.
Okay, that's really good to know.
Well, that's an optimistic view, but yeah.
Yeah, it's. I think. I think it's also a social commitment to it that is lacking. Not so long ago, there was a person who was bitten in a pub in Bangalore by a Russell's viper, and the city went, well, ballistic because everyone was worried about getting bitten by snakes. So there is, I mean, but we're still losing 50 or 60,000 people every year to snakebite. And there's, maybe three times that number who are suffering a permanent loss of life function. And there are others who suffer for a long time and then sometimes don't make it. So it's basically because we're usually not affected by it in an urban setting, and the ones who are affected have sort of resigned to the fact. At least in this region, it's that's how it is. They try and kill every snake they see and pretty much hope for the best. But it really requires a lot of social uh, motivation as well that is going to be able to change things around. Um, and we need to demand this of our administration and our government as well.
Right. Okay. So far we've discussed about the human aspect of this problem, whereas the snakes too are casualties. Like just as you mentioned, in some places of India, the snakes are revered, and there's no harm done to most of the snakes. Whereas if you look at some other parts of India, the snakes are mercilessly killed. They're like killed on spot out of fear of being bitten, which is logical, if you might say, because it causes a lot of damage to the people as well. So in this situation, so what do you think is the future for this, and how is your studies working to help make this better? So Gerry, I know that you've been studying Russell's viper using radio telemetry, and you're trying to find out how it works and what its dynamics, human snake dynamics is. So how has this project helped you study and understand this better?
Well, before I get to that, I'd actually like to point out that it's not logical to kill snakes. It's We've been killing snakes for hundreds of years, and there's still tens of thousands of people who are dying every year in the country. And this is the point that we bring to people when we're speaking with them here in our study area. That they constantly say, yeah, but we just kill the snakes, and then we say, yeah, but Sujata just died 2 weeks ago, and they understand that it's just the fear, but they're not able to deal with it. For that same, I mean, from that same point of view, we should be like grounding or stalling every single car because the number of traffic accidents and mortality is actually higher than this. It's just stigmas involved with snakes. One thing that we have found with Russell's vipers is they're actually quite reticent to bite. They don't like biting. We've been in a few situations where our trackers have been very, very close um, to the Russell's viper, and the Russell's viper is just hunkered down and not moved. And one story that we tell, well, pretty much everyone in this area now knows, is that someone went and did their morning ablutions about 15 or 20 centimeters from a coiled up Russell's viper, and the Russell's viper, despite the smell, didn't do anything. So I think, more than us understanding the Russell's viper, which is going to take some time. What we really are understanding is how much how much of the dynamics of the interaction. So we now have data of when we see most number of Russell's vipers dead, most number of calls we get at a time, and we've been able to superimpose the human activity with that. It usually follows seasonal changes or agricultural practices. So when they go to clear up their fallow fields, when they're plowing, when they're harvesting, this is when interaction is highest. And of course, then there's when the Russell's vipers are actually mating, which is that October to mid-December in this area, in this region. That's when people and Russell's vipers come most in touch with each other. And yeah, I mean, last November, we found nearly 3 dozen killed Russell's vipers, including two of ours that had transmitters in them. And one thing we have tried to ask the people around here is not to burn the snakes. So we are getting the data of, whether they're males, females, and we get our transmitters back without them being burned. So people are slowly understanding that. But actual change is going to take a lot longer. But credit where credit's due, the folks around here have really put their faith in us in just allowing us to, they call us to catch a Russell rep, and then we say, yeah, you know what, we're going to be putting a transmitter in it and releasing it back where we found it. And people are actually allowing us to do that. So I think that's the biggest step that we have actually made.
Certainly.
So I think education is the key, really. People kill out of fear, and fear comes out of ignorance. And so I think, especially tackling the younger generation, changing their view of snakes, making them understand, that there are things that they can do that can reduce the chances of snakebite. Actually, it's amazing how people can coexist with highly venomous snakes. I saw a video that was made by a friend of mine recently in a village in West Bengal, where they worship the monocled cobra. And it was just amazing. There were these huge monocled cobras just slithering past people's feet, being ignored.
Everywhere.
If they saw one come, they'd just, move away, let it go about its daily business. And they would just, it was just amazing how they, they could live with these creatures, children playing around and no problem at all. So, it is possible for people and venomous snakes to coexist. I just, we need to understand how to achieve that.
Right. So we need to strive to achieve this coexistence between human beings and snakes. And does supplying gumboots and providing torchlights such that you can avoid snakes in the night or things like that help with mitigating these snake bites? When you mentioned the education bit.
Anita, question to me. Yeah. Well, those are the regularly produced recommendations, and certainly, a lot of people probably get bitten when they're answering call of nature at night, going outside without any shoes on, without torch. So in theory, if you're wearing shoes, you should be less susceptible to snake bite. And if you've got a torch, you're more likely to avoid it because you can see where you're going and avoid stepping on them. But there are, it's a very simple recommendation that doesn't take into account lots of issues like, are people going to accept these changes to their lifestyle? Are they actually going to wear the boots? You can give people gum boots. Are they going to wear them? And there's actually been very, very little investigation of this. I know there was a trial in Myanmar where they gave farmers commercially produced gumboots, and they found take-up was very low because people who've never worn shoes in their entire lives have very different foot shapes to people who've grown up wearing shoes, and their feet didn't really fit in these commercially produced gumboots. And it wasn't until they actually started in collaboration with a local manufacturer producing especially for these particular farmers, this particular situation, that cheap and specially made boots that it, they began to wear them. Now I know there's something similar going on in Madras Crocodile Bank Trust, undergoing a similar sort of trial at the moment in Tamil Nadu. And the point that Gerry made earlier is that we often, trot out these rather trite recommendations without really thinking about these sort of details. And if we really want to make a change, then we have to think about behavioral change. And there's a whole science behind behavioral change. And we need, it's not, we need some of those people to be involved to actually help us understand what's actually needed and how to make people adopt these practices. Because torches are fine, you can distribute torches, they're cheap, but they need batteries to run. And once the batteries run out, are the people, given that they are very poor, are they going to be able to buy replacement batteries? Torches require quite expensive alkaline type batteries. They don't last very long with the cheap, the older style batteries. So, these are things that need to be think about. These rechargeable torches, where you use a dynamo, they're pretty useless, to be honest. So, these recommendations, how they're going to be implemented, really do need to have some thought about them and some actual trials to see how effective they are. So if you've got a limited amount of money, what's the best approach to actually reduce the number of snake bites?
Right. And Gerry, I do know that with the Lion Trust, you have also worked with the rural communities to improve the situation. So is there something that you do, like when you say that you spread awareness and education among the rural communities, what is it that you do which has the most impact?
Well, we don't know about impact yet. We've done baseline surveys looking at people's practices and perceptions. And now that the lockdown is lifted and everything, we will have to figure out how to do the subsequent surveys safely. But one thing that I can point out is that we initially, so along with Humane Society International India, we brought in a lot of solar lanterns and gave them to children. And what we did find is that the ones who have them use them a lot, but not to go out. Use them in their houses most of the time. A few of them did also use them outside. But the moment something like this gets spoiled, there's nothing that they can do with it. So it isn't a long-term solution at all. But we do talk about with people about using torches and all, and they usually use their cell phones to move around at night. We've given and continue to give a lot of gumboots out, and that seems to be making a big difference, especially for the men. Women, especially old women, not so much. They do hound us for the boots, but then don't use them. And that's probably because they're just heavy. We need to figure out. We'll be doing more surveys soon. We have a team that comprises some of our folks and some of HSI folks who are going around and will be doing the surveys as well. So we'll know more in a couple of months, I think. But the truth is, really, we have to somehow bring look for snake into our autopilot. And the truth is, in rural India, people aren't even looking before they cross a road. So how do we get them to actually look for a snake that is most likely not going to be there? And I think that's something that we need to rely on sociologists or psychologists, and those kind of folks, and behaviorologists, or whatever the word is for them, to bring in some level of or some structure for change.
Right. Okay.
I also think with the education aspect, there's so many organizations in India that do amazing work in their in the local areas, doing snake bite awareness training and so on. They go to schools and other community groups. But I think in order to reach a maximum number of people, it really needs to be in school curricula. I mean, they do have health education in school curricula. And given that this is such a significant health issue, it really ought to be included in school curricula. But for that, again, it's impossible for local, for us NGOs. Well, it's not impossible, but difficult to make that point. So it really needs someone at the, within the government circles to take this up as a cause and do, try and do this. So, but they need to be crosstalk as well. So I was aware recently I was sent a draft of a manual that was being produced for the ASHA workers, which actually had snakebite in it. But the information in there, they obviously hadn't actually consulted anyone who knew about the issue, because the information in there was not adequate, to say the least. So, if these initiatives need to be done, they need to be done in a proper way so that they actually talk to the people who can produce the right level of material.
Right. I do hope the government takes note of this such that this is changed in the education system right from the get-go. And so one other thing that I wanted to talk about is that we often come across new snake species being described in the Northeast or in the Himalayas or in the Western Ghats. So, as a person who is not in the herpetological field, I just wanted to know what is the importance of discovering these new species and how does it help the snake conservation all in all? Anita, would you want to speak about it?
Well, you can't conserve what you don't know is there. So, as I said earlier, we're finding these widespread species are actually composed of several distinct genetic units, whether that's at a subspecific level or a specific level, we don't really know yet. But if you don't know what's there, for one thing, if you're confusing species, then you're possibly confusing the treatment. And you certainly can't conserve it. So it's actually a general picture that's emerging across herpetology, right across Asia, is that once you do the detailed studies, you discover that these single widespread species don't really exist. Snakes especially tend to be much more bound by geographical boundaries. So, they don't disperse over mountains or big rivers and things. So you're ending up actually with a complex of closely related but distinct species. And of course, that's going to make a big difference to our understanding of whether they're threatened or endangered, because they turn out, you might think something's pretty widespread and therefore not at risk. Whereas when you realize that they're actually a complex of quite distinct and locally distributed species, their conservation status becomes of more concern. So for almost everything, whether you're, in the IUCN trying to do the red list assessment of species, or whether you're on the WHO trying to produce a list of medically dangerous snakes, it starts with the taxonomy. And so as I said earlier, it's really only very recently that people are doing these sort of in-depth studies in these very these areas which have been previously been rather neglected, like the Northeast. And you wouldn't have thought the Western Ghats was that neglected, but even so, a whole load of new species are coming up, if not already described,
Right.
in these areas.
And does this help?
Even around a place like Bangalore, if you look at it, one of the wolf snake species has been split. There were two snakes, neither of them rare, found around Bangalore. One is the cat snake, and another one is a wolf snake. And that just in the last decade. And this is, a place that is. There's one thing being a cryptic species, but these are snakes that look completely different from anything else that there is in the area. So I think it's just that the attention is being paid now, and yeah, there's going to be a lot more in the near future, I think.
Right. And does this help, just as how the tiger is considered the umbrella species and a lot of area becomes protected if there's tiger presence in it? Likewise, with the new species being described, like you said in Bangalore, can there be conservation reserves as a result of having these species discovered? Is that something that...
Well, I don't think snakes will ever have the platform that let's face it, tigers are really gorgeous, cuddly animals, devoid of most of the stigma that snakes have. And they're not really feared unless you're face to face with one. Snakes, on the other hand, have, whether be it reverence or, repulsion, people are really have extremes of a relationship with snakes. So it's not going to be easy to create uh, to use them as the flagship species of any sort. I mean, they don't even get the legal protection that they're meant to. People kill Schedule 1 snakes all the time, and no one says anything about it. But you kill or hit a tiger on a road, and there's media coverage all over the country.
So in general, I think that if you protect the habitat, then you're going to protect snakes. So with a tiger habitat, you should be, should be sufficiently large that be protecting any snake species that occur within that. I think habitat protection is the key really for reptile protection. There may be one or two species which fall outside that sort of idea, which occur in areas where there isn't a well-established protection network. But anyway, I think probably you want to draw this to a close now.
Yeah, so we have about 10 minutes left, and I would like to take up some audience questions as and when they come along. One question here asked by Tushar Jain is, what should be the first response after a snake bite? So, Gerry, would you want to take this question?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty straightforward. The important thing is to stay calm and sort of take charge of the situation. Remove any form of constraining items, rings, watches, bangles, karas, friendship bands, anything that might get tighter with swelling. Immobilize the limb, preferably below the heart. Don't tie any splints or anything, just use slings or carry the patient. And get straight to hospital and note any symptoms that you might see on the way. So then more importantly is what not to do. You never touch the side of the bite. Don't wash it. Don't cut it open. Don't burn it. Don't try to suck out the venom. You can't, and it causes more damage. Don't freak out. No coffee, tea, and even if you feel like a drink, no alcohol. Get straight to hospital. Also, it's important if you are in an area where there is a chance of a snake bite, it's important to just make that phone call to a hospital and find out which hospitals have anti-venom and which ones are prepared to treat snake bite. A lot of places don't treat snake bite because they're not comfortable doing it. So it's important to figure out where you can go. And fancy hospitals are usually not as open to treating snake bite or experienced with treating snake bites as our missionary hospitals, who get a lot of referrals from suburban and rural areas around.
Right. And one other thing is the tourniquets. Is tying a tourniquet as such something that's helpful when it will immobilize it? You just don't move it, and that's about it, right?
You don't move it. You don't tie a tourniquet. It's actually much more damaging because to treat for a few reasons. One, it blocks the venous blood flow, but not the arterial, I think, and that creates a lot more pressure. And when they do remove the tourniquet, it causes a gush of blood flow, and that will actually speed up the spread of venom as well. So it's better just to immobilize. They talk about pressure pads and pressure bandages, but that's an Australian thing where swelling is not part of their or most of their snakes symptomology. So it's important to just immobilize. Use a dupatta or a sari or a towel or anything and create a sling type of thing and get to hospital.
Okay. Right. So Anita, there's a question from Sonia, and she asks, what could be the probable reason for not getting permits in India? Like, why is it so hard to get permits from the forest department?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew. I think at least in some states, there's this perception that snake venom is a very valuable substance. I mean, there have been reports in the newspaper in West Bengal, certainly, and I think Goa is another problem area. But West Bengal's got so many international borders that they have these seizures of huge quantities of some kind of crystalline substance, which is claimed to be snake venom and is claimed to be worth crores of rupees. And so they have a natural suspicion of anyone who wants to collect venom, because they think that we could be misusing it, I guess. But, you know, none of this is another very strange thing. None of this so-called these huge smuggling rings for snake venom. First of all, what are they using it for? It's supposed to be something that people take when they're having raves. But honestly, you know, if you've seen the results for snake bite, would you voluntarily administer snake venom to yourself? I really don't. I don't know what the substance is. It might be some chemical substance that gives people a high, and for some reason it's called snake venom. But anyway, that might be one of the reasons. There's this perception that there's something underhand and criminal about wanting to collect venom. In other cases, I think it's just yes, snakes. People don't understand the urgency, perhaps, about why we want to do it and why it's important, not only just to do it for one snake, but to maybe to have a sample size that you can make some statistical inferences from. So I don't really understand why, but it's very, very difficult. And unfortunately, if you're resident overseas or not an Indian citizen, the layers of complications get even thicker.
And Gerry, would you want to add anything to it to do with the permission, since you've been working from India? And
I have no idea. It defies logic. You would actually think that the Indian government would be approaching experts and specialists within the country and internationally to help fix this problem. But it really has been self-motivated individuals and organizations who are trying to to figure this out and to solve it. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And yeah, we're generally faced with suspicion. In fact, around here, people think that we make crores of rupees from snake venom. And one of the reasons that is the media as well. So what the media has done is when there's an announcement that they've confiscated 3 kilos of venom, which would take years and I don't know how many thousands of snakes to produce. And then what they do is they check on what the rate the Irula cooperative sells its venom for, which is 10 or 12 times the mean for venom internationally. And that's what they feel the seizure is worth. So people think that, oh wow, you can make that much money from snake venom, but you can't. We get a whole bunch of people asking us about starting, a venom production center as a business. It's a daft business to start in India. You're not even going to cover your overheads, let alone make a massive profit out of it. So it really is misperception, and yeah, and I think people's trepidation about it, and with the authorities, I guess they're worried about if things go down wrong, will it boomerang on them? So I think that might be one of the issues.
So you mentioned how producing snake venom is an expensive business and not something worth getting into. So Aditya has a question there where he says, do pit vipers like hump-nosed and bamboo pit vipers inflict a significant number of bites? Is it worth producing an antivenom for these species whose bites aren't necessarily life-threatening?
Well, there's actually a lot of reports of hump-nosed pit viper bites and fatalities coming out from the Konkan area in Kerala over the last couple of years. There's a doctor called Dr. Preston Sirur who's been focusing on that quite a bit, and he's seen a lot of cases now. And so for hump-nosed pit vipers, we need to figure out what to do about it. I don't know enough about the medicine of it, and I think Preston is actually treating them we don't have an antivenom for them at the moment. But they do cause renal failure. I don't know enough about whether it's permanent or not. Bamboo pit vipers, I think it's like a really bad wasp sting, as far as I know. No? At least in the Western Ghats.
Oh, in the Western Ghats. Okay, I'll let you talk about the Western Ghats.
Yeah, no, that area I don't even know about. So I'm not even going to talk about there. But in the Western Ghats in Maharashtra and stuff like that, a lot of people actually get bitten issue with it. They have a lot of swelling and some cell damage, but that could also be because they're cutting open their wounds and all that stuff.
Okay.
So in the Northeast, that's a little different because the diversity of pit vipers in the Northeast is quite high and also a little underestimated at the moment. So quite a few new pit vipers have been described in the last couple of years in the Northeast, and I think that's probably going to continue as a trend. But when we talk about green pit vipers, there's a tendency to lump them together but they're actually, there's quite a lot of quite distinctly related species there, and they have very different venom. So we've been working on some of the venom of these species with collaborators in Tezpur University. And so we find that some of the Trimeresurus species that are related to the white-lipped pit viper, distinct species, the spot-tailed pit viper and so on, can actually produce quite serious blood coagulation disorders. And in one report, unfortunately, a lot of this is anecdotal. In one report, a boy was bitten, and in Himachal Pradesh, his blood was still incoagulable after 8 days. And of course, he was given polyvalent antivenom, but it didn't touch it really. So, that's quite a serious effect. And in our assays, we've actually found that the activity is almost as strong as that of Russell's viper. So in that respect, so there's often a perception that green pit viper bite isn't that serious, but there is some cause for concern, and the occasional report of quite serious effects.
Okay.
So, but this is what I say about what Gerry said, actually, but I completely agree with regional antivenom. There's no point including these species in an antivenom for the whole of India, because they don't occur in most of India, but they're very significant in the northeast and the Himalayan region.
So I think we've come to the end of the webinar. And if you have a couple of minutes of time, I would like to ask one more question from the audience. We have a lot more, but I'll just pick one and I'll just ask away. And this is to Gerry, if you have time for it.
Sure.
Okay. So the question here is, how effective are snake rescues in mitigating human-snake conflict? So usually the snakes are rescued and moved far away from the city or from the location. So does it benefit the snakes? Does it benefit the people? And this is asked by Patil.
Okay. I think that snake rescues are not particularly effective in. I think the practice of snake rescue, the way it's done in India, is not effective as a conservation tool. Most of the research that has been done on moving snakes from one location to another has pointed towards the snakes faring pretty poorly or even dying. So it's not really rescue, it's snake removal. I think a bigger issue with that is that it doesn't allow people to have to adjust. There's going to, as cities are expanding, people also have this thing of, we're expanding, and many people will say this about into the snake's territory. There are a lot of species that do very well in cities. It's not like the snake has come from somewhere else to the city, or or your house is a place that it's visiting. It's just part of the snake's range. And I think that relocation of any wild species doesn't seem to be working, and it's something that we need to stop. The other thing that snake rescuers are doing, they're really skewing the statistics of snakebite in the country. Snake rescuers are getting bitten at a ridiculous rate, and many are even dying because most snake rescuers, and I'll go out on a limb and say this, don't really know how to treat snakebite, or forget about treating, or the first aid of snakebite. And it's generally just a lot of bravado and machismo that's happening, and it's not good for the snakes. It's just it's very stressful, very traumatic for snakes as individuals, and of course the ecosystem and the ecology of the entire area don't benefit from it.
Right. Okay. So I think we can end the webinar with this, because there are a few more questions, but we have the time restraint as well. So I would like to thank you both for making this a very enjoyable discussion. And I'm sure that the audience has learned quite a bit from both of your experiences. So thank you for being here and making time for the webinar. I'm really honored for that. And I would I'd also like to thank the participants for being here with us today. Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions, but you can do write to me and I can forward it to both of them and get back the answers for this. Thank you.
Sounds good. All right. Bye, everyone. Bye, Anita. Nice seeing you.
Bye, Gerry. Bye. Thanks.